The first thing that stopped was my body. Not my heart, not my lungs. Those kept working faithfully, according to the doctors. What stopped was my willingness to participate in being alive. I didn't decide it consciously. I didn't give up. I just couldn't move anymore. My son Daniel died on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The call came while I was folding laundry, the radio murmuring softly in the background, like it always did. A state trooper's voice, careful and distant, told me there had been an accident. Slick roads, early darkness. One of those phrases people use when they don't want you to ask questions. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed afterward, still holding a sock in my hand, thinking, my body hasn't caught up yet. That was the last clear thought I had for a long time. The funeral happened. I know it did. People told me so. I remember fragments. The smell of lilies, the weight of a black coat on my shoulders. Someone pressing a casserole dish into my hands like food could fix this. I nodded when I was supposed to, spoke when spoken to. Then one morning, about 2 weeks later, I woke up and couldn't sit up. Not because of pain, because there was nothing inside me that said, get up. Doctors ran tests, blood work, scans, neurology. Everything came back, unremarkable. That word still makes my jaw tighten, as if the complete collapse of my life could be categorized so casually. They told me it was depression, adjustment disorder, complicated grief. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy. I let them label it however they needed to. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't sad in the way people expect. I was gone. For months, I lived in a half-sleep state, not fully unconscious, not fully awake. Time lost its shape. Days blurred, nights deepened. I stopped responding to messages, stopped caring if the curtains were open. I existed only in one place. My dreams. That's where Daniel was, not glowing, not angelic, just Daniel. Wearing the same jacket he'd worn the last Christmas we spent together. Sitting across from me, like he always had, elbows on the table, fingers tapping when he was thinking. At first, I thought it was my mind clinging desperately to him. That's what the therapists said dreams were. Processing, memory loops. But then he started saying things I couldn't explain. And one night, he said something that changed everything. "Mom," he said gently, "you haven't looked in the box." Cliffhanger type, the discovery. When I woke from that dream, my heart was racing in a way it hadn't since the day Daniel died. Not panic exactly, recognition. The kind you feel when someone says your name in a crowded room and you turn without thinking. I lay there staring at the ceiling, the early morning light barely reaching the corners of the bedroom, and I kept hearing his voice in my head, calm, certain. "You haven't looked in the box." At first, I told myself it meant nothing. Grief does strange things. Everyone says that. The mind invents meaning where there is none, especially when the body is still and the days are empty. I'd heard all of it from well-meaning professionals sitting at the edge of my bed, clipboards balanced on their knees, telling me that recovery doesn't follow a schedule. I nodded. I always nodded. It was easier than explaining that this felt different. The box existed. That was the problem. Daniel's belongings had come home in pieces after the accident. A duffel bag from the hospital, a small cardboard box from the police department, his wallet, keys, phone, all items I couldn't bring myself to touch. I'd stacked everything neatly in the hall closet, unopened, Like a landmine, I carefully stepped around every day. There was one box, though, that hadn't gone into the closet. It sat under my bed, pushed just far enough back that I couldn't see it unless I tried. That box had arrived 3 days after the funeral. No return address, just my name, written in Daniel's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Librarian's curse, noticing details even when you wish you wouldn't. I'd slid it under the bed without opening it, telling myself I'd deal with it when I was ready. Apparently, my dreams thought I was ready. The next few nights, the dreams continued. Daniel didn't speak much. He never pleaded, never accused. He just sat with me in places that felt familiar. The old kitchen table, the front seat of his car, the park bench where we used to eat sandwiches when he was in college. And every time, the same quiet reminder surfaced. The box, Mom. During the day, my body still refused to cooperate. I couldn't sit up for more than a few minutes without feeling overwhelmed. Not dizzy, not weak, just resistant. Like every cell in me was bracing against something I couldn't name. The visiting nurse suggested physical therapy. The therapist suggested medication adjustments. I agreed to everything and followed through with nothing. I was conserving energy for something I didn't yet understand. One afternoon, my sister came by unannounced. She'd been doing that more often, hovering at the edges of my life, unsure how to help, but unwilling to disappear. She stood in my bedroom doorway, arms crossed loosely, taking in the dimness and the drawn curtains. "You had another appointment today," she said carefully. "I know. You didn't go." "No." She sighed, the kind of sigh that carried both concern and impatience. "Helen, this can't go on forever." I wanted to tell her that forever already ended, that the timeline she was worried about no longer applied. But instead I said, "I'm listening right now." She frowned. "Listening to what?" I almost told her. The words hovered at the edge of my mouth. But something held me back. Not shame, protection. Whatever was happening felt fragile, like explaining it too soon might break it. That night, the dream changed slightly. Daniel didn't sit this time. He stood by my bedroom door. He looked younger than he had at the end, healthier, annoyingly patient, the way he'd been when he was a teenager, waiting for me to finish a lecture. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I'm not afraid," I answered, defensive even in sleep. "Yes, you are," he said gently, "but not of me." When I woke, I realized my hands were clenched into fists. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things that hadn't registered before. Small inconsistencies in the story of the accident, details that had seemed irrelevant at the time, smoothed over by shock and grief. A neighbor mentioned, offhandedly, that Daniel's car had been serviced just days before the crash, something I hadn't remembered hearing. A former co-worker of his left a voicemail, hesitated, then said, "I don't know if this matters anymore, but something never sat right with me." I saved the message. The dreams grew more specific. Daniel started referencing objects, not just the box, but things inside it, a notebook, receipts. "The blue folder," he said once, tapping the table like he was emphasizing a point. I woke up shaking that morning, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might finally be having the medical event everyone had been waiting for. Instead, I felt clarity. I didn't tell anyone what I was starting to suspect. Suspect isn't even the right word. I didn't know anything yet. But doubt had taken root. And once doubt exists, it demands attention. One afternoon, while the house was quiet and the rain tapped softly against the windows, I slid my legs over the side of the bed. It took me 10 minutes to stand, not because I couldn't, because my body resisted the idea like it was a betrayal. My knees trembled, my palms sweated. I had to pause halfway, breathing slowly, reminding myself that the floor was solid, that I wasn't about to fall apart simply by being upright. When I finally reached under the bed, my fingers brushed against cardboard. I froze. Not yet, something in me said, not today. I pushed the box back and lay down again, exhausted beyond reason. But I knew then that the stalemate was ending. Either I would open that box, or my body would never forgive me. That night, Daniel didn't appear in my dream. Instead, I dreamed of a car stopped on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in the dark. No sound, no motion, just waiting. And somewhere in the distance, the faint click of something metallic being loosened, one turn at a time. I woke with tears streaming down my face, my heart heavy with a truth I hadn't yet proven, but could no longer ignore. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt suspicion. And once suspicion enters the room, peace doesn't return until answers do. Once suspicion took hold, it didn't arrive loudly. It seeped in quietly, the way cold does when a window has been left cracked just enough to change the temperature of an entire room. I didn't suddenly sit up in bed, demanding answers. I didn't call anyone or announce my doubts. I simply became unable to ignore the feeling that something about Daniel's death had been unfinished. Grief had already dismantled my sense of time. Now it began dismantling my sense of memory. I found myself replaying conversations I'd had with Daniel in the months before the accident, moments I'd dismissed as ordinary at the time. The way he'd hesitated before answering certain questions, how he'd changed the subject when I asked about work, his habit of saying, "I've got it handled, Mom," in a tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Lying there in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it traced the same slow circle again and again, I wondered how many warning signs I'd missed simply because I trusted him to manage his own life. That's what you're supposed to do when your children are grown. You step back. You let them be adults. You don't hover. I'd done everything right. And yet, here I was, questioning whether doing everything right had also meant looking away at the wrong time. The dreams changed again. They became less conversational and more fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle being laid out without explanation. Daniel stopped speaking in full sentences. Instead, he showed me images: a parking garage, a desk drawer, a set of keys laid out neatly, as if someone wanted to be sure they wouldn't rattle. I woke up each time with the same sensation, not fear, but urgency. My body still refused to fully cooperate, but my mind was awake now, painfully alert. During the day, I started remembering things with startling clarity. The police officer who'd knocked on my door had been kind, but rushed. He'd used phrases like, "no signs of foul play" and "single vehicle accident," words that felt official enough to quiet questions before they formed. I hadn't asked for the full report. I hadn't requested the vehicle inspection. I hadn't done any of the things I'd later realize were options. At the time, I couldn't imagine needing them. Who questions the circumstances of their child's death when the wound is still open? But wounds don't close just because time passes. They close when something makes sense. One afternoon, my sister returned, bringing soup I didn't eat, and concerns she didn't know how to voice. She sat beside my bed, smoothing the edge of the blanket like she used to do when we were children sharing a room. "You've been different," she said finally. "I know. Different how?" I hesitated. Then I said the closest thing to the truth that felt safe. "I think I stopped too soon." She looked at me, confused. "Stopped what?" "Looking." She didn't push. My sister has always known when pushing would only make me retreat further. She stayed a while longer, talking about her grandchildren, the weather, things that still moved forward, even though my world felt paused. When she left, she hugged me longer than usual, as if she sensed I was standing on the edge of something. That night, I dreamed of the box again, only this time it was open. I could see inside it clearly, too clearly. Papers stacked neatly, a notebook with a bent corner, a small envelope tucked underneath everything else, its flap sealed. I reached for it in the dream and woke up with my arm extended into empty air. I cried then, not the quiet tears I'd shed in the early weeks after Daniel died. These were sobs that shook my chest, raw and animal, fueled by exhaustion and anger, and a dawning awareness that grief had been asking something of me all along, and I'd been avoiding it. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in months. I got out of bed, not gracefully, not easily. I sat up first, heart pounding, waiting for the familiar resistance. It was there, but weaker now, like a door that had been locked for so long it no longer fit its frame. I put my feet on the floor and waited. My legs trembled, but they held. I didn't go far, just to the edge of the bed. But it felt monumental, like crossing a border. I stayed there for a long time, breathing slowly, reminding myself that listening didn't require belief. I didn't have to decide whether the dreams were messages from beyond or the mind's last defense against unbearable pain. I only had to follow where they were leading. By late afternoon, I was exhausted again. But the exhaustion felt different now, purposeful. Before, my body had shut down as if protecting me from the world. Now it felt like it was asking me to finish something. That evening, I asked my sister to come back. When she arrived, I told her about the box. Not about the dreams, not yet, just the box. I told her I thought Daniel might have left something important inside it. She looked at me carefully, searching for signs of confusion or fixation. Instead, she found resolve. "Do you want me to get it?" she asked gently. "No," I said. "I need to." We sat together on the floor of my bedroom, backs against the bed. She slid the box out from underneath and placed it between us. For a moment, neither of us touched it. The cardboard was scuffed, unremarkable, just a box, and yet it felt heavier than it should have been. "Are you sure?" she asked. I nodded. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were things I recognized immediately. Daniel's handwriting, his careful organization, receipts folded neatly, a small spiral notebook filled with notes I didn't yet understand. And beneath it all, just as I'd seen in the dream, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front. I didn't open it right away. I picked up the notebook first, flipped through pages filled with dates, dollar amounts, names I didn't recognize, margins crowded with question marks. On the inside cover, Daniel had written one sentence in block letters. "If anything happens to me, this matters." My sister sucked in a breath beside me. I felt something inside me shift, sharp and unmistakable. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't symbolism. This was preparation. I reached for the envelope, and as I broke the seal, I understood why my body had refused to move for nearly a year. It hadn't been shutting down. It had been waiting. I didn't open the envelope right away. I know that sounds strange, considering everything that had led to that moment. But there are times when instinct tells you to pause before crossing a line you can't uncross. The room felt different once I knew the box held intention instead of memory. Until then, it had been grief I was avoiding. Now it was truth, and truth has weight. My sister watched me carefully, the way people do when they're trying to read someone without alarming them. She didn't reach for the envelope. She didn't urge me on. She just sat there, grounded and steady, as if lending me her nervous system while mine recalibrated. I appreciated that more than she knew. When I finally opened it, the paper inside was folded once, cleanly. Daniel had always been deliberate like that. No wasted gestures, no unnecessary drama. The letter was short, written in the same tidy handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for years. There was no greeting, no goodbye, just instructions. He wrote that if I was reading this, something had gone wrong. He said he didn't want to scare me, but he wanted me to know he hadn't been careless. He mentioned his business partner by name, Mark Ellison, and said there had been disagreements that went past words. He told me the notebook explained everything, and that I should not confront anyone directly. He underlined that sentence twice. My sister's face had gone pale by the time I finished reading aloud. She asked if I wanted to stop. I shook my head. I felt oddly calm, like the emotional storm had already passed, and this was the cleanup afterward. Devastating, yes, but organized. We went through the notebook together, page by page, slowly. Dates matched calendar entries I remembered Daniel mentioning casually. Lunch meetings, late nights, client issues. The receipts told a story of their own, payments Daniel had made to cover company expenses that should never have been his responsibility. Notes about disagreements over money, over ethics, over something Mark wanted rushed and Daniel wanted documented. One page stood out. A sketch of a car, crude but clear. An arrow pointed to the undercarriage with the words, "Check this again," written beside it. My sister looked at me, eyes wide. "That's not normal," she said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." The escalation didn't come from panic. It came from necessity. I couldn't unsee what I was seeing. And once the possibility of intent entered the picture, everything else demanded re-evaluation. The official story, the investigation, the speed with which the case had been closed. The next day, I asked my sister to help me make calls. Not to the police, not yet. First, I wanted information, accident reports, maintenance records, anything publicly accessible. It took effort. My body protested. I had to rest between tasks like someone learning to walk again. But each small step forward made the next one easier. When I finally contacted the police department to request the full accident file, the officer on the phone sounded surprised, but not dismissive. That mattered. He told me there was no problem with my request, but warned that reopening cases took time and new evidence. "I may have some," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. That's when things started moving faster than I expected. Within days, I received a call from a detective named Ruiz. He spoke carefully, professionally, but there was an edge of interest in his voice that hadn't been there before. He asked about the notebook, the letter, the sketch. He asked how long I'd had them. "About a week," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Mrs. Crawford," he said finally, "some of this should have been flagged earlier." The words sent a chill through me. Not comfort, not validation, fear. Because if it should have been flagged, it meant it hadn't been, and that raised questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. Detective Ruiz came to the house the following afternoon. He sat at the kitchen table Daniel had once leaned against while telling me about his plans for the future. I poured coffee with shaking hands and apologized for my condition, for my slow movements, for needing to sit down more often than I used to. Ruiz waved it off. He wasn't there to judge my stamina. He was there to listen. He took photographs of the notebook and the letter. He asked precise questions. Had Daniel ever expressed fear? Had he mentioned tampering with his car? Had I noticed anything unusual after the accident? I answered honestly. Sometimes "I don't know" was the only answer I had. When he left, he told me they'd need to re-examine the vehicle. I laughed quietly at that. "What's left of it?" I asked. "Enough," he said. "Sometimes it's enough." The escalation wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Paperwork, interviews, requests for records. But beneath it all, tension built. I could feel it in my chest, a tightness that wasn't grief this time, but anticipation. For the first time since Daniel died, something was happening that didn't revolve around loss. It revolved around accountability. Mark Ellison called me 2 days later. I recognized his voice immediately. Smooth, concerned, practiced. He said he'd heard I'd been asking questions, that he understood grief did strange things to people, that Daniel wouldn't want me reopening wounds. The audacity of speaking for my son nearly took my breath away. "I'm not reopening anything," I said calmly. "I'm responding to what he left behind." Silence. Then a shift. Subtle, but unmistakable. He told me I was misinterpreting Daniel's notes, that business disagreements were normal, that stress could make people paranoid. He suggested, gently, that I focus on my health. I thanked him for his concern and ended the call. That night, the dreams returned. Not symbolic this time. Clear. Daniel standing beside his car, hood open, pointing without speaking. I woke up with my heart pounding, but instead of fear, I felt confirmation. Whatever I believed about the origin of these dreams no longer mattered. They were aligned with reality, and reality was catching up. Within weeks, the escalation became visible. Mark was interviewed. His financial records were subpoenaed. A mechanic came forward, hesitant at first, then detailed, about a rushed inspection request and an instruction that hadn't sat right with him at the time. I watched all of this from the sidelines, my body slowly re-entering the world as my purpose clarified. I started walking again, short distances at first, then longer. It was as if the part of me that had shut down was slowly powering back on, circuit by circuit. But with escalation came pressure. Not everyone was pleased that a closed case was being reopened. I received anonymous messages suggesting I let things go, that I'd already lost enough, that digging would only hurt more people. I ignored them. Pain had already done its worst. Silence wasn't protection anymore. The moment I realized how high the stakes were came when Detective Ruiz sat across from me again and said, "We're treating this as potential homicide." The word hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. I thought of Daniel's letter, of his careful planning, of the box under my bed that it waited patiently for me to be ready. And I understood then that the year my body had shut down wasn't wasted time. It was preparation, because what came next would demand more strength than grief ever had. The word homicide didn't explode into my life. It settled, quietly, like dust after something heavy has fallen. Detective Ruiz didn't say it for drama. He said it because that's what the evidence was starting to suggest. And once a thing is named, it can't be unnamed. I sat at my kitchen table long after he left, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. I didn't drink, listening to the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Mark time with a patience I hadn't felt in myself for nearly a year. The house was the same house it had always been, but I wasn't the same woman sitting inside it. I could feel that clearly now. Grief had hollowed me out. Purpose was filling the space back in. The confrontation didn't begin with raised voices or dramatic accusations. It began with proximity. Mark Ellison started showing up places I didn't expect him to be. At the grocery store, lingering near the produce section, pretending to examine apples he never put in his cart. Outside the library one afternoon, when I forced myself to walk there again, leaning against his car as if it were coincidence. Each encounter carried the same tone, concern wrapped around control. He never mentioned the investigation directly. He talked about Daniel instead, about how hard this must be for you, about how Danny wouldn't want conflict. He used my son's nickname the way some people use a weapon gently, smiling while they apply pressure. Every time he spoke, I felt something tighten inside me. Not fear, recognition. This was the man Daniel had been protecting himself from. One afternoon, he crossed a line. He came to my house. I heard his car before I saw it, the low rumble pulling into the driveway like it belonged there. My first instinct was to retreat, to pretend I wasn't home, but something steadier overrode that impulse. I had spent too long immobilized by silence. I wasn't doing that again. I opened the door before he knocked. Mark looked surprised. He recovered quickly, of course. People like him always do. He held his hands up slightly, palms open, the universal signal of harmlessness. "Helen," he said softly, "I was hoping to talk." "I know," I replied. "That's why you're here." We stood on the porch, the late afternoon sun slanting across the yard. Daniel used to mow when he visited. Mark glanced past me into the house, as if assessing how much access he still had. I didn't invite him in. "I think this investigation is getting out of hand," he said, lowering his voice. "It's reopening wounds that don't need to be reopened." "You mean yours?" I said. The smile flickered. Just for a second, long enough to confirm what I already knew. "I mean everyone's," he corrected. "Daniel and I had disagreements, yes, but business disagreements happen. Stress does things to people. It makes them see threats where there aren't any." I leaned against the doorframe, steadying myself. "Daniel documented his concerns," I said. "That's not stress. That's preparation." Mark sighed, as if I were a stubborn child. "Helen, with all due respect, you've been through something traumatic. You haven't been yourself. People are worried about you." There it was, the pivot Daniel had warned me about. Question the mother. Undermine her credibility. If you can't control the facts, attack the source. "I've never been more myself," I said evenly, and the police seemed to agree. His jaw tightened. "The police don't know Daniel the way I did." "You didn't know him well enough," I replied, "to stop." Silence stretched between us, thick and dangerous. The neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. A car passed. Ordinary life continued, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding on my porch. Mark straightened, the warmth draining from his expression. "I'm going to say this once," he said. "You don't want this to go to court. Trials are ugly. They tear families apart. They don't bring people back." "No," I said, "but they bring truth forward." He stepped closer, invading my space just enough to feel intentional. "Daniel made mistakes," he said quietly. "Big ones. If this goes public, his reputation won't come out clean." That's when the grief surged back up, hot and sharp. But it didn't drown me this time. It sharpened me. "My son knew what he was risking," I said. "He left records because he expected this." Mark's eyes flicked toward the door behind me, as if imagining those records in his hands. "And what if you're wrong?" he asked. "What if you've misinterpreted everything? You'll have destroyed an innocent man's life." I held his gaze. "Then the evidence will show that." He stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words finally stripped of performance. "I truly am." I watched him walk back to his car, his shoulders tense now, the mask cracked beyond repair. I closed the door and leaned against it, my legs shaking with delayed reaction. I wasn't proud of how my body responded, the trembling, the weakness. But I didn't judge it either. Courage doesn't cancel adrenaline. It coexists with it. The official confrontation came weeks later, in a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. I wasn't present for Mark's arrest. Detective Ruiz spared me that. But I was there for the interview that followed, sitting across from two investigators as they asked me to recount everything again. The notebook, the letter, the phone calls, the visit. When I finished, one of them leaned back and said, "Your son was very careful." "Yes," I replied. "He had to be." The trial took months. I didn't attend every day. My strength was returning, but slowly. I listened to recordings when I could, read transcripts, learned details I hadn't wanted to know about Daniel's final weeks. The financial dispute, the threats disguised as pressure, the rushed maintenance appointment that now stood out like a flare in the dark. The confrontation reached its peak not in court, but in a single piece of testimony from the mechanic who'd finally spoken up. He described being told not to document a repair, how that request had bothered him, how he'd remembered it when the investigation reopened. That was it, the moment the story collapsed under its own weight. When the verdict came back, guilty, I didn't cry. I sat very still, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of the year behind me lift in a way nothing else could have accomplished. Justice doesn't erase loss, but it anchors it. It tells you that the universe noticed. Afterward, Detective Ruiz shook my hand. "You didn't give up," he said. I thought of the months in bed, unable to move, of the dreams, of the box under my bed, waiting patiently. "I didn't know how," I replied. "But my son did." The confrontation was over. The truth had spoken, and what followed wasn't relief. Not yet. It was something quieter. Resolution was coming. The day after the verdict, I woke up before dawn for the first time in nearly a year, without that familiar heaviness pinning me to the mattress. The house was quiet in the way it only is when the rest of the world hasn't caught up yet. No appointments, no investigators, no legal updates waiting to drop like stones into my chest. Just stillness, real stillness, not the frozen kind I'd been trapped in before. That was when I understood something important. The turning point hadn't been the conviction. It had been the moment I chose to listen instead of force myself back into life before I was ready. Justice was the outcome, not the catalyst. For months, people had treated my shutdown like a malfunction, something broken that needed fixing. But standing there in my kitchen, barefoot on the cold tile, coffee percolating the way it always had, I realized my body hadn't failed me at all. It had done the one thing my mind couldn't. It had stopped everything, so I could hear what grief was trying to say. I began noticing changes in myself that weren't dramatic, but unmistakable. I could stand longer without shaking. I walked around the block without needing to sit down halfway. I started cooking again, not reheating meals brought by others, but choosing recipes, chopping vegetables, letting the smell of onions and garlic fill the house. Ordinary acts that felt almost rebellious after so long. People assumed the trial's outcome was what pulled me back. They said things like, "Now you can finally move on," or "At least you have closure." I smiled politely and let them think that. Closure is a word people use when they don't know what else to say. What I had wasn't closure. It was alignment. My body and my truth were finally in the same place. The dreams changed again. Daniel didn't appear every night anymore. When he did, he wasn't urgent. He didn't point or insist or repeat messages. He just sat with me. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. Other times he'd say something simple about the weather, about a book I was reading, about nothing that mattered. And that's how I knew something had shifted. The dreams no longer needed to push me forward. They trusted me to keep going on my own. One night, I dreamed we were in my living room, the one with the old floral couch I'd been meaning to replace for years. Daniel sat at the far end, feet on the coffee table, like I'd always told him not to do. I started to scold him out of habit, and he laughed, the real laugh, not the careful one from the earlier dreams. "You're okay now," he said. When I woke up, I didn't cry. I felt steady, grounded, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. The turning point became visible to others, not because I announced it, but because I stopped apologizing for existing at my own pace. I declined invitations without explanation. I accepted help without guilt. I corrected people gently when they described my year as wasted time. "It wasn't wasted," I said. "It was necessary." Some people nodded, pretending to understand. Others looked uncomfortable. That discomfort didn't belong to me anymore. I met with Detective Ruiz one last time to finalize paperwork and return original documents. He thanked me again for my persistence. I told him the truth, that persistence hadn't felt heroic. It had felt instinctive once I stopped fighting it. He paused, then said something that stayed with me. Most people ignore instincts when they're inconvenient. I thought about how inconvenient my shutdown had been, how uncomfortable it made everyone around me, how quickly the world tries to rush grief into something manageable. After he left, I took out Daniel's notebook again, not to analyze it this time, but to acknowledge it. I read through the pages slowly, noticing how methodical he'd been, how careful. I didn't feel the sharp pain I'd felt before. I felt pride. My son had trusted me enough to leave the truth in my hands, even knowing it might take me time to be able to hold it. That trust changed me. I started sorting through parts of my life I'd neglected long before Daniel's death. Old dreams I'd put on hold, classes I'd meant to take, people I'd drifted from because life had gotten busy. Grief stripped my life down to its bones, and now I could choose what to rebuild instead of automatically restoring what had been there before. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, I found a note Daniel had written years earlier. Just a scrap of paper with a grocery list on one side and a sentence on the other. "You always know when something's wrong, Mom. You just pretend you don't sometimes." I laughed out loud, a real laugh, startled by the sound of it in the quiet house. He'd known me better than I'd known myself. The turning point wasn't about returning to who I was before. That woman no longer existed. It was about becoming someone new, someone who trusted her own internal timing, even when it didn't make sense to others. I stopped seeing my body as fragile and started seeing it as intelligent. It had taken me out of circulation not to punish me, but to protect me until I was strong enough to act. Rest wasn't avoidance, it was preparation. And as my strength returned, so did my sense of agency. I wasn't moving forward because someone told me it was time. I was moving forward because my body finally agreed. One evening, as the sun set outside the kitchen window, I realized something else had changed. I was thinking about the future without immediately feeling guilty for it. For months, any thought beyond survival had felt like betrayal, as if living meant leaving Daniel behind. Now I understood that living was the only way to honor what he'd done. The turning point wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, the way dawn does, gradually, inevitably, until you suddenly realize you can see clearly again. And with that clarity came the final stage of this journey. Not answers, not justice, but meaning. The resolution didn't arrive with relief. That's something people don't warn you about. They assume justice brings peace the way medicine brings sleep, quickly, decisively. But peace, I learned, is quieter than that. It seeps in slowly, testing whether it's safe to stay. In the weeks after the trial concluded, I noticed how much of my identity had been suspended during that year of shutdown. Friends had learned to speak around me carefully, as if grief made me fragile glass. Family members had taken over decisions I once made without thinking. Even I had begun to see myself as someone paused, waiting for permission to resume. Now, with the truth out in the open and Daniel's name cleared, that pause felt unnecessary. The world hadn't stopped for me, but I had stopped for it. And now I was stepping back in, cautiously, on my own terms. I started with small acts of reclaiming. I went back to the library where I'd volunteered for years before Daniel's death. Walking through those doors again felt like entering a former life, one I wasn't sure would recognize me. The smell of old paper and furniture polish wrapped around me instantly, familiar and grounding. The head librarian hugged me without words, the kind of hug that didn't ask for explanations or updates. She simply said, "We're glad you're here." Not back. Here, present. That distinction mattered. At home, I began rearranging things, not out of restlessness, but intention. I moved Daniel's framed photo from the hallway into the living room where I could see it daily, not like a shrine, but like a companion. I didn't want to tuck him away anymore. His absence had already taught me what avoidance costs. I wanted his presence to feel integrated into my life, not isolated as a reminder of what I'd lost. The dreams came less frequently now, but when they did, they felt different. Not urgent, not instructional. They were gentle, almost mundane. Daniel would sit beside me on the couch while I read, occasionally glancing over my shoulder at the page. Sometimes he'd comment on something trivial, my choice of book, the way the light fell through the window. When I woke from those dreams, I felt comforted, not compelled, as if whatever task he'd needed me to complete had been finished, and now we were simply coexisting. I thought often about the year my body had shut down, about how terrifying it had seemed to everyone else, how helpless I'd felt inside it. And yet, in hindsight, I could see that year as a cocoon. I hadn't been dormant. I'd been transforming. The stillness had forced me to confront grief without distraction, without productivity, without the constant pressure to be okay. It had stripped life down to its essentials: breath, memory, truth. The resolution wasn't just that Mark Ellison was convicted. It was that Daniel's voice, whether born of my subconscious or something beyond my understanding, had been honored. The evidence had spoken, the system had listened, and my body finally had let go of its guard. I met with a grief counselor months later, not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand what had happened to me without pathologizing it. She listened carefully as I described the shutdown, the dreams, the gradual return. When I finished, she didn't rush to explain it away. Sometimes, she said thoughtfully, the mind copes by doing. Sometimes it copes by stopping. Neither is wrong. That sentence settled into me, like a truth I hadn't known I was waiting for. For so long, I'd felt embarrassed by that year, by how little I'd accomplished, how absent I'd been. Now I saw it differently. I hadn't failed to function. I'd chosen, unconsciously, to survive in the only way available to me at the time. Daniel's case became quieter news as time passed. New stories replaced it. The world moved on, as it always does. But occasionally, someone would recognize my name and stop me in the grocery store or at the post office. They'd say things like, "Your son was brave," or "You did right by him." I thanked them politely, but inside, I knew the truth was more complicated. Daniel had been brave, yes, but he'd also been scared, and I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I'd simply listened when it mattered. The resolution settled fully one afternoon when I realized I hadn't thought about the accident in days. Not avoided it, just hadn't been pulled toward it. My thoughts had shifted to what I wanted to plant in the garden next spring. Whether I should finally take that art class I'd postponed for years. How I might spend my time now that my days were no longer consumed by waiting. I still missed my son. That never changed. Grief doesn't end. It integrates. It becomes part of the architecture of your life. But it no longer owned every room. I wrote Daniel a letter then, not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to speak. I thanked him for trusting me, for being careful, for finding a way to reach me when I couldn't reach myself. I told him I was living again, not because I was over losing him, but because losing him had taught me something I couldn't ignore, that life is fragile, yes, but also persistent. The resolution wasn't closure, it was continuation. I learned to honor grief without surrendering to it, to trust my body even when it chooses stillness, to accept that healing doesn't always look like progress from the outside. Sometimes it looks like disappearance, followed by reemergence. And perhaps most importantly, I learned that listening to intuition, to memory, to the quiet messages we're taught to dismiss, can change the course of things in ways we don't understand until much later. By the time I reached this point, I no longer needed proof that Daniel had reached out to me. The justice had come. The truth had been seen. Whether the dreams were a bridge between worlds or the mind's last fierce act of love didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I listened, and that listening gave my life back to me. Life after grief doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a ribbon or a clear starting line. It slips back in quietly, testing whether you're paying attention, whether you're ready to notice it without panicking. For a long time after everything settled, the trial, the truth, the return of my strength, I waited for some grand feeling to mark the beginning of after. It never came. What came instead was something far more subtle. Normal days. At first, they felt suspicious. I'd wake up and wait for the heaviness, the dread, the sense that my body might betray me again and refuse to move. When it didn't, I'd lie there longer than necessary, testing myself. Was this real? Was I allowed to just get up? It took months before I stopped checking in with myself like that, before I trusted that my body and I were finally on the same side again. I started noticing ordinary pleasures with an intensity that surprised me. The sound of the coffee pot clicking off, the way sunlight crept across the kitchen floor in the late afternoon, the weight of a book resting on my chest while I read on the couch. During the year I was shut down, the world had continued without me. Now, re-entering it felt like learning a language I'd once been fluent in, and had to relearn slowly, word by word. People assumed I was better. That's the word they used. Better implies finished, resolved, cured. I didn't correct them. It wasn't worth the explanation. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes less sharp, less consuming, but it never fully leaves. And I didn't want it to. Grief was the proof that Daniel had mattered, that love had existed in a way that permanently altered me. What did leave was the fear that something was wrong with me. For a long time, I'd carried quiet shame about that year in bed. Even as people reassured me, I felt defective, weak, broken in some essential way. Society doesn't know what to do with stillness unless it can be turned into productivity. My shutdown hadn't produced visible progress. No inspirational photos, no brave updates, just absence. And absence makes people uncomfortable. Now I understood that absence had been the point. My body had taken over when my mind couldn't process the magnitude of loss. It had put me into a kind of hibernation, not to escape reality, but to survive it long enough to face it properly. That idea changed how I looked back on that year. It wasn't a gap in my life. It was a chapter, just written in a language most people don't know how to read. I began talking about it more openly, but selectively. Not everyone deserved access to that story. Some people listened only to satisfy curiosity. Others listened because they recognized themselves in it. Those were the conversations that mattered. Women my age would lean forward slightly when I described the shutdown, their eyes softening. "I thought it was just me," one of them said quietly after I spoke at a small support group. That sentence alone made sharing worth it. Daniel remained part of my daily life, but not in a way that consumed me. I spoke to him sometimes when I watered the plants he'd bought me years ago. I caught myself setting aside articles I thought he'd like before remembering I no longer needed to do that. Those moments hurt, but they didn't undo me. They were reminders, not reopenings. The dreams came only occasionally now. Sometimes weeks would pass without one. When they did appear, they were brief and unremarkable. Daniel smiling, nodding, moving on with his life somewhere beyond my understanding. I stopped analyzing them. I no longer needed them to guide me. Whatever their source, they had done their work. I thought often about the phrase people had used early on. Your body shut down. They'd said it like a diagnosis, like something had gone wrong. I rejected that framing now. My body hadn't shut down. It had intervened. It had taken control when my conscious mind couldn't bear what it was being asked to hold. That realization gave me a respect for myself I hadn't had before. Not pride, exactly, but trust. Trust that if life ever demanded something impossible of me again, some part of me would know how to respond. I rearranged my life slowly. I didn't rush into big commitments or dramatic changes. I learned the value of pacing, of letting readiness arrive instead of chasing it. I took a class I'd postponed for years. I traveled to visit an old friend I'd drifted from during the hardest period of my life. I laughed again, not out of relief, but because joy had quietly reintroduced itself and found me willing to let it stay. Sometimes people asked if I believed Daniel had really reached out to me, if the dreams were something supernatural. I always answered the same way. I believe the evidence was real. The rest doesn't need a label. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked disappointed, as if they wanted a clearer answer. But ambiguity is honest, and honesty mattered more to me than satisfying anyone's curiosity. What I know is this: without those dreams, whatever they were, I would never have opened that box. Without opening that box, the truth would have stayed buried. Without the truth, my body might never have agreed to rejoin the world. Call it intuition. Call it the subconscious. Call it love refusing to be silenced. The explanation matters less than the outcome. Sometimes the body stops so the soul can listen. That's not a poetic idea to me anymore. It's lived experience. If you're listening to this and you're in a season of stillness you don't understand, if your body feels heavy, uncooperative, unwilling to move forward, please hear this gently. Stillness is not failure. It's not laziness. It's not weakness. Sometimes it's the only way the mind can survive what the heart has lost. Healing doesn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looks like disappearance, followed by return. I didn't come back the same woman I was before my son died. I came back more honest, more patient, less willing to override my own instincts to make others comfortable. Grief took many things from me, but it also gave me something unexpected: permission to listen to myself without apology. Daniel's life mattered. His death mattered. And the year my body went quiet mattered too. Thank you for listening to Echo Lens Stories. If this story resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like yours deserve to be heard.